What you're about to hear is a minority report on Biden's endgame in Afghanistan, including the chaotic evacuation in August 2021. The popular view, perhaps the majority view, is that it was a lousy job, that Biden bungled it. But as I see it, the opposite is true. He made the best of a very bad situation which he had inherited from Donald Trump. A personal note. I was never an eyewitness to the Afghan war, but as the CIA's last intelligence analyst in Vietnam and one of the last evacuees to be lifted off of the U.S. Embassy roof there, I'm cursed with a certain sensitivity to the issues, the intelligence issues particularly, surrounding lost causes and worst-case scenarios. It is through this prism that I view the facts set out in this audio essay. Many armchair moralists and Trump supporters are still gleefully flailing Biden for allegedly not doing enough to help the many Afghans who sided with us during the war or who modeled themselves on our own image. The president is still being lambasted for not keeping a residual force in place to protect our friends and preserve our supposed gains. He's being chastised just as viciously for not sending enough aircraft during the evacuation to save all those who fit our definition of the good and worthy Afghan. On all counts, he's getting a bum rap and being judged against objectives that were never realistic or achievable or even part of his own agenda. Let's start at the end with an assessment of the evacuation itself. For perspective, please keep in mind that retreat is always the most dangerous of military operations. Crawling out of a country standing up demands more moral flexibility than anyone should have to embrace in a lifetime. No U.S. government agency offers staff instructions on how to play God, which is what you have to do if you're trying to hustle countless desperate people onto the last outbound fixed wing or chopper. And executing such an operation under hostile conditions is predestined to be seen as a debacle. Predestined, because not everyone who wants to get out will make it. That said, by any reasonable measure, and certainly as compared to the precedent we set in Vietnam, the airlift out of Kabul was an astounding success, especially considering these facts. The Afghan army disintegrated overnight with barely a visible ripple. The entire Kabul regime evaporated in a day, literally. Taliban forces were so much in control during the final 2 weeks that the U.S. was obliged to secure their help in securing the last key exfiltration point, Hamid Karzai Air Base. Despite these appalling conditions, the U.S. and its coalition partners evacuated in those same 2 weeks 123,000 people, twice as many souls as fled Saigon with official U.S. help during the entire last month of the Vietnam War. According to the official headcount, U.S. aircraft alone rescued 79,000 civilians from the Kabul airport. Some were third country nationals. Most were Afghan citizens, including U.S. embassy workers, high-risk individuals and their families, and other recipients of special U.S. immigrant visas. A particular moment in the evacuation story provides a perfect rebuke to those who condemn Biden for pulling out too soon. On August 15, 2021, with the airlift kicking off, the host government imploding, and the Taliban pouring into Kabul, General Kenneth McKenzie, head of the U.S. Central Command, struck an inspired, if inevitable, bargain with Taliban leader Abdul Ghani Baradar. McKenzie persuaded Baradar to commit Taliban manpower to guard duty at the airfield in exchange for the U.S. keeping hands off everywhere else. At that point, the U.S. troop contingent, which had been tripled to service and safeguard the pending evacuation, numbered 6,000 strong. 11 days after the McKenzie-Baradar deal, despite Taliban checkpoints and American eyes on every approach route, an ISIS suicide bomber planted himself outside the main airport entrance, Abbey Gate, and blew himself up. More than 170 Afghan and 13 U.S. service personnel were killed. Those Biden critics who insist that if he had only chosen to keep 2,500 residual troops in Afghanistan indefinitely, he might have bucked up resolve in Kabul, stabilized the situation, made an emergency airlift unnecessary, reinforced our counter-terror capabilities for the long haul. These critics who say all this need to consider the implications of the Abbey Gate massacre. If 6,000 U.S. troops backed by NATO and Afghan personnel were not sufficient to keep one determined zealot from wreaking havoc, how in hell could a 2,500-man residual force do any better? If such a contention had ever been green-lighted, it would have become the target of choice for every terrorist in country, with each new American casualty creating an excuse for an open-ended expansion of the U.S. footprint and an ever-escalating, never-ending war. The Abbey Gate attack was final proof that the Commander-in-Chief, Joe Biden, knew what he was doing. And for his unrepentant, die-hard critics, there is this. In July of this year, 2022, 2 Hellfire missiles launched from a CIA drone during an over-the-horizon kill mission incinerated al-Qaeda boss Ayman al-Zawahiri as he loitered on a balcony in downtown Kabul. These missiles also delivered a chastening message to any would-be 9/11 copycat who mistakenly believes that Afghanistan is now an inviolate safe haven. Let's look at the bigger picture. The hand that Biden was dealt in Afghanistan could not have been more prejudicial. At the Doha conference 12 months before, Donald Trump had written the terms of the U.S. troop withdrawal with no regard for our Afghan allies or our own security needs, his main purpose being to remove the forever war as a political liability for himself. In essence, he agreed to the dismantling of the remaining U.S. military presence, then about 14,000 strong, with the last U.S. troops set to leave in early May 2021. He made no provision for a general ceasefire, much less enforceable Afghan-to-Afghan peace talks. The two sides were left to muddle through on their own. The Taliban, for their part, agreed to cold shoulder terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and to suspend their own attacks on U.S. troops so Trump would be spared any flag-draped coffins coming home during election season. But the Taliban also committed the U.S. not to mount any preemptive military operations in support of Afghan government units. The deal made Kissinger's peace agreement for Vietnam look like the return of Prince Metternich. Trump's one-time national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, later called it a surrender agreement. Now, that doesn't let Biden off the hook, of course. He could have done better in providing for the most imperiled Afghans. But here again, a nasty hand-me-down from his predecessor handicapped his options. During Trump's final 2 years, his immigration spoiler-in-chief, Stephen Miller, mucked up the issuance of special visas for Afghans and Iraqis to preserve the whiteness of MAGA America. This, according to whistleblower Olivia Troy, who once worked for Vice President Mike Pence as a counterterrorism advisor and who witnessed Miller's depredations firsthand. Biden, once in charge, tried to accelerate visa processing and use the visa roster to single out Afghans most deserving of our protection. There was no comparable master list to be found anywhere in the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, even on the last day of that war. Biden also ordered the discreet drawdown of surplus U.S. Embassy officials starting in late April 2021, 4 months before the end. Nothing like that happened in Saigon until the last minute. Biden critics are right about one thing. The president did resist making any sudden lurch towards the exits, but there was good cause. President Ashraf Ghani warned him that any such action would destabilize what little stability the Kabul regime still enjoyed, and what little leverage it could bring to bear in the hoped-for negotiations that Biden was trying to broker between the two sides. Biden also worried that a policy of hurry up and go would require insertion of substantial security forces to support the evacuation just when he was edging towards a zero troop headcount. This isn't post facto rationalizing to make Biden look good. It is based on thorough reporting, breakthrough reporting by Steve Cole and Adam Entus in the New Yorker magazine, December 10th, 2021. Read it. Look it up. Read it. It'll educate you. Soon after the Biden inauguration, according to these two reporters, the new president extended the troop bug-out deadline set in Doha in order to buy time for the two Afghan sides to join in a proposed summit in Turkey. The conference would have done what Trump did not: work out a power-sharing arrangement between the two Afghan sides to stop the fighting, with the U.S. playing umpire. Now, under Biden's revised timetable, the last U.S. forces, instead of bowing out by May 1st, 2021, the Doha deadline, were to wait until 9/11/2021 to be fully gone. This slippage was designed to keep the strategic balance steady enough to give the envisioned summit conference a chance. But the Taliban were already well past any earnest negotiating or any incentive to move in that direction. Under cover of the Doha Agreement, and with increasing velocity after Biden took office, their forces had engineered the quiet collapse of government outposts throughout rural Afghanistan using bribery, subversion, and sub rosa intimidation. As one Afghan cop later explained to the Washington Post, the departure of the Americans was like oil on a fire. The cop said to the Post reporter, "Without the United States, there was no fear of being caught for corruption. It brought out the traitors within our military." Unquote from the cop. Afghan troops and police units under these circumstances deserted in droves. Security outside of a few major cities turned to smoke. According to one estimate, by the time Biden began his summit lobbying, the strength of Afghan security forces had dropped from a theoretical paper high of 300,000 to 93,000 actual fighters, and that was putting the best face on the numbers. The Taliban, given their edge, quickly nixed the summit idea. President Ghani was not any more receptive. Biden advanced the date for the U.S. military shutdown, pegging it to August 31st instead of 9/11. Most remaining U.S. combat troops were gone by early July 2021, leading to closure of Bagram Air Base. Bagram. Now, here's a sidebar that explains so much. Once the nerve center of all U.S. military and intelligence operations in country, the huge compound had two major runways compared to one in Kabul. It had hardened perimeters and a cell block full of 5,000 of the most dangerous ISIS and al-Qaeda operatives anywhere. Crouched within spitting distance of the Hindu Kush Mountains, Bagram Air Base was the ideal springboard for a second airlift if one were necessary to supplement a major hard pull out of Hamid Karzai Airfield, roughly 35 miles to the south. Why didn't we hold on to Bagram? In the judgment of Politico magazine's Pentagon reporter Laura Seligman, Bagram fell prey to a newly altered mindset on the part of top U.S. military commanders. She described it in a post-evacuation article as a combination of peevishness and risk aversion arising from Biden's decision to overrule the generals on the troop withdrawal issue. Seligman wrote, "Once that happened, once the decision on the troop withdrawal was made, the Pentagon embraced as quick a withdrawal as possible, including from Bagram. And the Pentagon stuck to that approach," she says, "through the beginning of July 2021, regardless of conditions on the ground." Speed equals safety was now the general's mantra, she reported. One ex-defense official told her, the generals just decided they lost the withdrawal argument and said, okay, fine, let's get the heck out of Dodge. And get the heck out they did. Overnight, on July 1st, 2021, resident U.S. forces packed up and snuck out of Bagram without emptying the cell block or alerting the local Afghan commander, all for the alleged purpose of keeping the Taliban in the dark about their departure. Whatever the rationale, the sudden pullout spooked the Afghan government and military, according to Seligman, ended our control of the main U.S. military air base before the pullout was complete, and appeared to accelerate the collapse. This is all of Seligman's reporting. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, later explained to Congress that it was simply a matter of prioritizing Kabul's safety. He said, if we were to keep both Bagram and the embassy going, that would be a significant number of military forces that would have exceeded what we had. So we had to collapse one or the other, and the decision was made, the decision being to abandon Bagram. Meanwhile, at the U.S. Embassy and in Washington, contingency evacuation planning kept chugging along, and private American citizens were urged to leave the war zone. But there was no shared sense among U.S. topsiders that the balloon was about to burst. Indeed, up through midsummer 2021, even as Biden began pressing President Ghani to trade land for time and extend a concessionary hand to the enemy, the conventional wisdom in Washington was that Afghan forces could hold their own for a year to 18 months after the departure of the last U.S. troops. Some jarring notes did seep into the soundtrack from time to time. In the lead-up to Biden's announcement on April 14th that all U.S. troops would be out by late summer, every top general responsible for Afghanistan had complained within channels that such a decision, the elimination of all boots on the ground, would lead to the rapid collapse of Afghan forces. General Milley would later testify to Congress that he had warned both Trump and Biden that 2,500 to 3,500 troops were needed to maintain some version of the status quo in Afghanistan and to prevent the country from becoming host to a new generation of foreign terrorists. His concerns were echoed by the chief of the Central Command, General McKenzie, and the last U.S. Supreme Commander in Afghanistan, General Austin Miller. But as Biden would later confirm, there was disagreement, a split, he would call it, among his military advisors over the number of residual forces required, the appropriate timeline for their removal, and whether any of this would lead to stability. In the end, he had followed his instincts and the advice of his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and had opted for a total troop shutdown, albeit under an extended deadline, coupled with efforts to bring about a diplomatic solution. The generals had then shifted from protest mode to grudging cooperation and had hastened withdrawal of remaining U.S. forces, the Bagram-related speed equals safety decision. They'd also become remarkably accepting of interagency assessments that gave our allies a respectable reprieve from sudden and imminent collapse. This is the important part. According to a later New York Times report, one upbeat projection, which was delivered to the president on April 24, 2021, held that Afghan forces could fend off the enemy for 1 to 2 years. 5 days later, General Milley told reporters that government troops, Afghan government troops, were reasonably well led, well equipped, well trained, even if their ability to operate effectively without U.S. military backstopping was still to be tested. The Times reported in midsummer that a high-ranking intelligence official in Washington, though increasingly uneasy about the strategic picture in Afghanistan, quote, still predicted that a complete Taliban takeover was not likely for at least 18 months, unquote. Another insider, identified by the Times as a senior administration official, advised the newspaper there was no sense that the Taliban were on the march. On July 8, 2021, just after a quickie meeting with President Ghani in Washington, Biden famously declared, quote, "There's going to be no circumstances where you see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy of the United States from Afghanistan," unquote. By August 3rd, just a few days later, according to the New York Times, top administration officials received an updated intelligence estimate that suddenly reeked of ambivalence. They were told that, quote, "district capitals across Afghanistan were falling rapidly to the Taliban, and the Afghan government could collapse, not would, but could collapse in days or weeks," unquote. But they were also assured that while this was an increasingly plausible outcome, it was not the most likely outcome. Still hedging their bets were the intelligence officials in Washington. Only on August 12, 3 days before the fall of Kabul and initiation of the emergency evacuation, did the U.S. intelligence community clock to the fact that no predictions were possible about the shelf life of the Afghan army. None at all. Despite everything we thought we knew or pretended to believe, we had been blindsided about the resiliency of friendly forces. Shortly after the evacuation, Generals Milley, McKenzie, and Miller, the 3 Afghan cage fighters, as one source described them to me, appeared before 2 congressional committees to do a little scapegoating. The generals tried to pin blame for all recent humiliations on Biden and others in the administration who had ignored their advice and zeroed out our troop presence in Afghanistan. A subtext to their blame gaming was the idea that the drawdown had robbed us of vital intelligence capabilities and made it impossible to predict what was coming. General Milley fleshed out this argument in a Senate hearing on September 28, 2021, just a few days after the evacuation ended. He did so with an assist from Biden's own Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, who neatly summarized what he thought we had missed in our intelligence reporting. Austin said of our allies, quote, "We did not fully comprehend the depth of corruption and poor leadership in their ranks. We didn't grasp the damaging effect of frequent and unexplained rotations by President Ghani of his commanders. We did not anticipate the snowball effect caused by the deals the Taliban commanders struck with local Afghan leaders," unquote. Asked to explain such errors, General Milley linked them directly to shrinkage of our military footprint. He said, "We pulled our troop advisors off 3 years ago. And when you pull the advisors out of the units, you no longer can assess things like leadership. We can count all the planes, trucks, and automobiles, and cars, and machine guns, and everything else, but you can't measure the human heart with a machine. You gotta be there," unquote, General Milley. The generals venting didn't compute. None of them bothered to address the seeming paradox that even with a 2,500-man contingent in place through much of the past half year, the worst had happened anyway, nor could they rid themselves of the stigma of having missed all the final warning signals. Milley told reporters shortly before the evacuation ended in Kabul, he said, "There was nothing that I or anyone else saw that indicated a collapse of this army and this government in 11 days, unquote, General Milley. General McKenzie later admitted to Congress that he too had been caught off guard by the sudden toppling of the regime. Quote, "I did not foresee it to be days away," he said. "I thought it would take months," unquote. Let's pause to consider the true source of our myopia. During the hinge years of the American war in Afghanistan, 2014 to 2018, the Special U.S. Inspector for Afghan Reconstruction queried key U.S. decision makers, military and civilian, about lessons to be learned from our involvement. The results were classified, but a Washington Post reporter, Craig Whitlock, used the Freedom of Information Act to access many of the interviews. In a subsequent book, The Afghanistan Papers, he quoted from select confessors, from Generals Milley and Michael Flynn to diplomats like Ryan Crocker. Whitlock provided, using these interviews, what is probably the most concise explanation available of why we failed to see what was coming in Afghanistan. What emerged from the documentation was evidence of a chronic unwillingness on the part of our best and brightest to acknowledge that after all the infusions of manpower, blood, money, and arms, America's Afghan stepchild just was not up to our illusions. It was the very enormity of our investment and our sacrifice that had made the enormity of our folly impossible to admit out loud. The same thing had happened in Vietnam. The simple term for such willful blindness is hubris. Most of the principals questioned by the IG were fully aware that our Afghan allies suffered from terminal corruption. But these same insiders, by their own admission to the IG, often kept the truth from their own superiors and everybody else, for fear of shaming themselves and all those who had suffered or died for our objectives. When it came to vital development projects like opium suppression, the retraining of Afghan farmers, or the delivery of finance loans to Afghan women, when it came to these topics, official progress reports about them were always too upbeat, the Inspector General learned. Colonel Bob Crowley, a senior counterintelligence officer in Afghanistan, told the IG, quote, every data point was altered to present the best possible picture. Surveys, for instance, were totally unreliable, but reinforced the idea that everything we were doing was right. We became a self-licking ice cream cone, unquote. By Crowley's account, bad news was often stifled, he said, at the command level. And when we tried to air larger strategic concerns about the willingness, capacity, or corruption of the Afghan government, it is clear it was not welcome. So said Colonel Crowley. General Flynn, who served as military intelligence chief in Kabul during the Obama years, groused to the IG about the fake optimism he discerned among his colleagues. He said, from the ambassadors down to the low level, the consensus was, we're doing a great job. Really? So if we're doing such a great job, said Flynn, why does it feel like we're losing? The IG himself, John Sopko, advised Congress in early 2020 that an odor of mendacity clung to official U.S. assessments of the war. Whitlock, in his own commentary, inserted in his book, describes a revealing episode involving General Milley that dated back to Milley's tour in Afghanistan as deputy to the top U.S. commander there. Appearing at a joint military ceremony in May 2013, Milley assured Afghan troops they were, quote, on the road to victory, on the road to winning, on the road to creating a stable Afghanistan, unquote. Folks, is it any wonder that Milley and similarly invested architects of the war were unable to comprehend in 2021 that the game was up? Let's examine the failed ideological mission. The devil is in the details, of course, but much of what foredoomed the U.S. mission in Afghanistan and much of what complicates any assessment of Biden's own performance falls under the smudged rubric of nation building. Biden was always a minimalist on Afghanistan, just as he had been on Vietnam. As Obama's vice president, he once declared that Afghanistan mattered far less to our strategic calculations than neighboring nuclear Pakistan. In a public statement justifying his decision to follow through on a complete troop withdrawal, President Biden emphasized that the key U.S. mission in Afghanistan had been accomplished with the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011, and that our war on terror had since shifted to battlegrounds elsewhere. In none of his relevant pronouncements did Biden express enthusiasm for pacification or counterinsurgency strategies that included a messianic impulse to indoctrinate the Afghan populace in Western values. It's therefore ironic that much of the negative coverage of Biden's Afghan policies focuses on the plight of people in Afghanistan who had little or no role in our counterintelligence mission and whose current vulnerabilities owe to a playbook Biden never endorsed. Indeed, many of the most vociferous critics of his decision not to maintain a residual troop presence in country cite the ongoing suffering of Afghan women who grew up during the height of the U.S. involvement and became hooked on Western concepts of equality and modernity, and are now being persecuted by Taliban clerics and tribal chiefs bent on returning them to medieval servitude. Now, I have the most profound sympathy for these women and all other Afghans who are suffering because they identified with American values and could not make it onto an evacuation flight. But if you insist on condemning Biden for not pursuing policies or maintaining a troop presence sufficient to protect these policies or its beneficiaries, then be honest, you're faulting him for not committing us to an open-ended nation-building campaign. Remaking a Stone Age culture into an inclusive modern society is nation-building by any name. You can fault various administrations for fueling false expectations among Afghan women and men, now yearning to cast off the constraints of their own heritage. But Biden was right. Our own interests in Afghanistan, more importantly our capabilities, could never have accommodated what was required to recast the country into our ideal image of a modern state. Nor were the successive Kabul regimes competent enough or corruption-free enough to abet such an effort. As General McKenzie has suggested, our original sin in Afghanistan was mission creep on steroids, allowing ourselves to be drawn away from our initial small-bore objectives into an ambitious crusade to bring the 21st century to a defiantly feudal, patriarchal, tribal society. Throwing more American lives and treasure into such an enterprise would have been one more illogical, feudal, and therefore immoral policy choice. Unless the client host government to which you're committed is free of enemy subversion and systemic rot, unless you're willing to make American lives forever hostage to a presumed moral imperative and pay the price in blood, unless you're willing to do this, the best you can do in a place like Afghanistan, or Vietnam for that matter, is to keep your objectives fact-based, mission-specific, and non-evangelical, and to remember your own limitations and those of your ally. That last admonition is not the least. One of the great unlearned lessons of Vietnam, as I see it, boils down to this: for God's sake, get to know your friends, their strengths, and their deficiencies every bit as well as you presume to know your enemy. Then own that knowledge without any sugarcoating. Biden picked up on that wisdom and tried to act on it, if not always successfully, in Afghanistan. Would that others had taken the same cue.